lot of, there's a lot of fears. There's a lot of financial constraints that are out in the general public at the moment. And as well, there's quite a lot of pressure from some areas to reopen. And I guess it's really important at this point just to note that we can't get rid of all of the risks that are out there, and so it's actually okay to say that things aren't reasonably practicable. That's a legal phrase, but it's not possible at this point in time to open. So start right at the beginning. Everybody needs to be comfortable with what they're doing and how they're doing it, and fundamentally the choice to open lies with the facility. So I'll cover that off right at the end, but the important thing within this is that the safety of the visitors and the athletes lies with the facility to manage, and the way that we can do that is through risk assessment. And one of the questions that keeps coming back is what needs to be in the risk assessment, and I'll go through those. There's two very key areas that need to be covered, but specifically the risk assessment needs to be for an individual facility, because there's so little evidence out there at the moment. The guidance coming from the government is very, very high level. At Loughborough, we're working very hard to look at some of the things that we can do in terms of cleaning items, but this process at the moment, it's very, very important that the facilities specifically look at the risks that they're facing based on the customers that they've got, or the athletes that they've got, general public, and everything else that sits within it. So the really important thing at the beginning, I'm just going to switch over to a slide here. One of the really important things in evaluating the risk, and it's actually a legal responsibility when you do a risk assessment, is that you evaluate the risks that are being faced, and then you control the risks based on the level of risk that you've got. So it's very good practice to follow. The Health and Safety Executive has 5 steps to risk assessment. And within this, we're looking at what are the hazards, and in this, the hazard is the transmission of a virus. We're expecting that all facilities have got all their risk assessments up to date at the moment, and if they've been reviewed during this period, that's a really helpful thing to do. And in the evaluation phase here, as we work across, we're talking about what the hazard is, which is infection control. Who might be harmed? So this can be staff, athletes, coaches, members of the public. Shouldn't be spectators at the moment, but this is a fast-moving piece, and might expect that to come into play in the next period of time. It's really hard to know where the government will ease things at what point. And then we have a look at the initial risk rating, and for most of the things around infection control, the initial risk rating is going to be at least a medium risk. Now in this, I'm going to use low, medium and high, because that actually is as far as we can go. We can't give this a value. We can't have a standard 5x5 matrix, because there is no way of actually assessing it to numbers. So we're going to talk about low, medium and high, and then we're going to do about what we can control the risk, and then the resultant risk rating should be, ideally it should be low, and we should be satisfying ourselves that that's the case. Now in the template that's up on the screen at the moment, it's got an action by an individual, and that's quite good practice. However, in deciding this, it really should be a sort of consultative process. So it needs to be more than one person, because everybody's going to have a different view. People have a different feeling about what the level of risk is and how the transmission risk might be managed based on the number of people. And we've seen across different home countries. So in Belfast, the Mary Peters track opened a little while ago. They initially talked about having a capacity of 30, because the Northern Ireland Executive had a slightly different standpoint on how they were easing restrictions. But they very much opened on 12 athletes initially in 4 groups of 3, and worked on that for a period of time until they could prove that the controls that were in place were working. and then start to work out from there how they could increase up their numbers up. And they haven't yet quite got to 30, although they can do it. They've got to 20, and that's where they're comfortable as a facility operator. So that's a really useful bit as we start to look at good practice all around the UK. But also, as Ed will cover off in a little while, there are facilities that are starting to open in England, and the process that they're going through is actually a really important part of the knowledge sharing that we're doing when we haven't got the evidence behind us. So we're going to talk about the hazard, which is infection transmission, or controlling the infection. And within this, there's typically two types of transmission risk. There's aerosol transmission and surface transmission. So aerosol transmission is the where the virus is in droplet form, and this is usually in your breath or in coughing or some kind of element that's coming out of the mouth. And surface transmission is exactly what it sounds like. It's where the virus is on a surface, and it's then picked up and put into your mouth, typically through touching. So on the slide that's up at the moment, we're talking about the survival rate of surfaces exposed to artificial sunlight. And the important thing to understand here is this is why the guidance at the moment and the easing from government is coming from the outdoors, because what it's saying is that where there's strong sunlight, the virus can only survive for 2 minutes. Which is compared to about 10 hours on an indoor environment. So when we're looking at the risk assessment, we're talking about opening toilets, we're opening about changing rooms or not opening changing rooms. Very much the consideration in this is the effect of UV on the half-life or the time that the virus stays viable. And then you can also see that the same thing applies in aerosol there. So the bottom bullet point is saying that in outdoor aerosol, the half-life is typically it's inactivated very, very quickly. And this is a lot of what's driving the kind of risk controls and the things that we can do in order to make things safe. So it's really, really important to understand that indoors, the virus can last for a lot longer than it can outdoors. Then if we just move on a little bit, the other bit about the wind risk, now this is coming out as more and more evidence is becoming available. So in Belgium and Holland, where people are exerting themselves and they've got a higher breathing rate and they're moving at a higher speed, their requirements on social distancing are slightly increased over 2 meters. And what this piece of evidence is saying here is that at 4 kilometers an hour, we might see the virus being transmitted at a wind of 4 kilometers an hour. We might see the virus being transmitted up to 5 meters. Now, this obviously starts to have a bit of an impact when we talk about gathering people around in a group, and they might be socially distanced at 2 meters. Now, we're not trying to overreach the government guidance here. 2 meters is the requirement. But it's worth being aware of if you're opening facilities and there's gathered areas or where that things are happening. Just by moving the orientation of groups, you can change that social distancing to reduce that risk to a much lower level. If I just flip back onto camera view, just so that you can see me, one of the things that we also need to consider is the difference between soft surfaces and hard surfaces. So, classic example at the moment in throws, discuses and hammers are very easy to clean because they're hard surfaces and you can disinfect them normally. If you take a javelin with a soft handle, it's much, much harder to disinfect a soft surface, and that's where we're talking about the restriction on sharing implements, because it's so hard to disinfect, and it's also unknown how quickly the virus degrades in that period of time. So we know on a hard surface, if it's left in the UV light, then it's probably going to be free of a virus within kind of 6 or 8 minutes. And that's one of the things that's starting to kind of lead the thinking about how to disinfect things like sand pits. So, you know, the things that we've been trying in Loughborough have been involving using Milton fluid, a disinfectant in solution, and then put that in the sand and then allow it to dry. But if we're able to rake the sand over more aggressively and leave it open to the UV, we're able to kill the virus as well. Although obviously it's the surface that's being affected rather than deep into the sand. So the way in which the sand is raked is really important. I think also it's worth having a quick discussion about the difference between gloves and and the use of good hand washing. So obviously if we glove up and touch something that has the virus on it, the virus is on the outside of the glove. We move to another item, and we then transfer the virus onto that, and then we deglove and the virus is gone. Typically, a lot of the advice that's coming out at the moment is that good hand hygiene is really, really important to the surface touch transmission. So when the risk assessments are looking at the surface transmission, you know, washing your hands, making sure there's signage that encourages athletes and coaches to wash their hands is really, really important. The other quick thing to pick up on in terms of controls is the fact that although we may be able to operate at the moment with groups of 1 to 5, it may be that your risk assessment says that actually isn't a comfortable place to be based on the facilities that you've got. Although that's the guidance, can you still reduce that transmission risk to an acceptably low level at that point? So again, don't be concerned about trying things at a lower level first. We don't need to go to full operation and full capacity straight away. It's absolutely okay to start slightly lower and pick up from there. In terms of some things that are often overlooked, when things are disinfected, there is an interaction between the disinfectant and the thing that's being disinfected. If that thing is safety critical, then following the manufacturer's instructions and guidance is really important. So in athletics, we're typically talking about things like landing beds. So landing beds have a foam inside them, and the foam may react to the disinfectant, might become harder, it might shorten the lifespan. And so from a facility provider's point of view, checking with the manufacturer, whichever the manufacturer is, either on the original instructions or directly with the manufacturers, finding out exactly how to or what an okay disinfectant is, and having that signed off is quite important. Again, if we're using disinfectants, some disinfectants fall under COSH, so the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health. That should be in place already at a facility, but just to make sure that anything that's being used is added on to that COSH register is a really good thing to do. Also worth thinking about what happens if there's a confirmed case of COVID at the site. So we talk about the normal operation, but then what happens if somebody is found to be positive with a COVID test? What the extra cleaning requirements might be, what the situation might be in terms of extra training for staff or any additional PPE that might need to be in place there. And also quite, a question that's coming up now is the ability to contact, so the sort of track and trace element of who's been at that site and enabling those people that have come into contact with it to be followed up, really, to make sure that they can either get a test or they can isolate themselves in line with the government guidance. And finally, I guess one of the other things that gets overlooked is the emergency procedures. So again, activities going ahead absolutely fine, and then there's a fire evacuation. So when we then take those 20 people maybe who are at the track, and we put them at a muster point, can we still ensure that they're socially distanced? Are there any pinch points along the way? How do we manage those things as that goes forward? First aid procedures, it was a question that came up this morning. CPR has changed now, so there's no longer the rescue breaths that go with for a first aider, so it's compression only. Dealing with minor first aid, you're obviously going to have to break the social distancing guidance there. So perhaps the inclusion of a surgical mask for both the casualty and the first aider would be a useful inclusion in the first aid kit, because obviously the idea of a mask is to prevent the person breathing out from transmitting any disease. So if you're treating somebody else, then having a mask on would be the sensible thing to do. Again, at purely personal level, this isn't a UK athletics standpoint at all. But for me personally, my personal risk assessment is that if somebody was having a life-threatening incident, I would deal with the life-threatening incident there and then I would go and get myself tested or isolate, or test and isolate. But I would absolutely do that risk assessment of saying this person is going to be in a very, very poorly way if I don't deal with this. So that for me, there's again the grading of how first aid provision might take place and how that could be managed to reduce the amount of infection transmission that's taking place. I think one of the things that has been asked quite a lot is where the sort of liability insurance element lies within this. So appreciating that a lot of facilities have their own insurers and they may well have their own requirements as a result of that. But the general principle at the moment is that an individual specific robust risk assessment is going to be the starting point for any way of defending liability. So that risk assessment that is specific to your facility, that is created by a group of people in consultation, and if there are other stakeholders in consultation with them, is a really key bit of being able to prove that you've thought about and evaluated the risks. And that's why that the risk rating prior to controls and then evaluating it afterwards is a really, really good way of proving that you've thought about the risks that are there. And the duty, who has the duty? It's the person who controls the activity. So again, in athletics, this ends up typically being a little bit of a joint duty, because the facility operator will have a duty to ensure that they've done as much as is reasonable to open the facility in a way that there isn't a high transmission likelihood of COVID. But the person that then is in control of the activity has to prove that they've thought about all of the things that might be specific to their athlete group in that facility on that day. So again, it might be that you would risk assess things slightly differently in June to in October, just based on the amount and the strength of the UV that's out there. I hope we'll pick it up a little bit later. I'm sure Ed will, but there is a health and safety helpline that's available to you, and that is definitely something that you should make use of as you're going through the process of risk assessing and looking at how to get facilities open. And I think, Chris, from my point of view, that's probably covered off everything that I want to cover.
That's great. Thanks, Ash. I'm going to pass over to Ed in a second. Just a couple of things I wanted to quickly bring up. Questions that came in, I think we dealt with the first aid one. Someone asked a question about, can a coach work with 2 groups of 5 at the same time? Essentially, the answer to that is no. We would, as per normal good practice around coaching, we would expect a coach to be supervising one group, or each group to have a coach or a coaching assistant in place to supervise them, whether that be 1, 2, 5, or if times were normal, whatever the group size was. So simple answer is no. And then I think we had another question around how practical the jumps guidance is that's been issued today. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time going through that right now. I guess all I would say is a lot of what clubs are going to have to go through is going to be really, really challenging to get sessions up and running in a practical way. It's going to work for them and their athletes and obviously take into consideration government guidance and all the restrictions that would be imposed locally through the site. So it's going to be challenging, absolutely. I guess if there's any more support we can offer with looking at solutions for that, then maybe drop us an email and we'll arrange a time to have a conversation, or have a conversation with one of our coaching team who may be able to come up with some, I guess, some more practical solutions on that matter. Okay, I think that was all the questions dealt with that we've had at the minute. Ed, I'm going to hand over to you in that case.
Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. So I'm assuming everyone else can.
Okay, so yeah, I'm Ed Hunt. Good evening, facilities manager with England Athletics. I've been involved in athletics all my life. I guess I still kind of call myself an athlete, but I was an athlete in my younger years. I'm grounded in a facility background, really. I've worked in development roles for the governing body, but I've been in facility management. I was chief executive of a leisure trust, so I understand some of the challenges that venues face in normal times as well as now. In a normal world, I provide support to operators in terms of facility provision. So that can be track mark accreditation, meeting minimum standards, cage refurbishments at the moment, and also support clubs in developing positive relationships with their operators, as well as technical issues like new builds, refurbishments, equipment suppliers, etc. But unfortunately, we're not in a particularly normal world at the moment. So clearly venues and clubs, people on this webinar are facing challenges, particularly those from lockdown. So up to 2 or 3 weeks ago, there were no facilities open because of the government guidance. But when the one-to-one guidance came out, then obviously it opened the door to potentially to athletics facilities to open. So a couple of weeks ago, we ran a survey because we wanted to establish what position facilities were in, what challenges they'd faced during lockdown, and what challenges they foresaw sort of moving forward. So I just wanted to run through, so it'd be worth running through a few of the results from that survey. So the first few questions were around security of tenure and who operated the facility. But when we got into question 4, it was about how COVID had affected the club or the organisation that managed the facility. And no surprises that the majority of venues had closed and a lot of organisations had furloughed staff. Loss of revenue, loss of income was a big factor, up to 50k in a couple of examples. And from a club perspective, loss of income generation for the club because of a lack of events and competitions and school bookings. So the less obvious impacts were a reduction in maintenance. So during closure, the tracks weren't being maintained and cleaned, grass wasn't being cut, buildings weren't being maintained. So there's sort of a period of catch-up that's required when venues are to reopen. And one thing that was interesting is a couple of operators said that actually, in terms of the cost of closure, income aside, it hadn't saved them an awful lot of money, or because the costs were relatively low in terms of running costs, sort of minimal energy costs aside from floodlighting, etc. So it was more on the income side that operators were struggling. If we look at this table, which is particularly interesting, we asked, and the latest results are on there, so this is only a couple of weeks old. We asked how many facilities were open and how many were closed. And you can see from that, out of 82 responses, only 11 were open. So we're talking sort of 10-15% of venues at best are open at the moment. Not surprising, I guess, in the context of what's happening. But we did also ask when the operators anticipated reopening the facility, and you can see, hopefully you can see the responses on there that said the majority, or a big chunk, are looking at June and more so July. So, but even then, you're looking at 60% of venues, so nowhere near getting back to full capacity, which obviously has an impact for clubs and also competitions. And you can see sort of by the end of August, September, you're getting up to more 70%, 80%. But interesting that a lot of venues, an awful lot of venues, aren't looking at reopening until July time. So questions 7 and 8 were about issues around reopening and once they're open. So it was just an assessment really of what the venues were feeling and what some of their concerns were and how they're planning to reopen. So as Ash has talked about, risk assessments are really key to the process, and operators fed that back, saying that risk assessments were key. Normal operating procedures needed to be adjusted to take account of the pandemic, and making sure that they complied with any new standards they introduced. So that was going to be a particular challenge for them, because they wanted, or they were looking at staff to make sure that people were complying with the new rules and regs, if you will. So that was an additional burden for them. Pleasingly, a lot of operators referenced the NGB guidance that we produced and government guidance, saying that they obviously needed to be comfortable, that they could adhere to that guidance before they opened. I guess Normal World is a track full of people on Tuesday, Thursday nights, and operators were cognizant of the fact that that can't exist or won't exist for the foreseeable future. So it was a lot of discussions around less numbers. Is it viable to open with fewer numbers? Can we spread clubs over more nights? Therefore, everyone gets a chance, but you're spreading the operation over 4 or 5 nights as opposed to 2. And then some of the stuff that Ash spoke about earlier around hygiene of equipment, implements, and importantly, ancillary areas, sort of toilets and changing rooms for use for athletes, coaches, etc. Question 8, similar to the pre-opening responses, but again, what challenges do you foresee post-coronavirus? So again, you've got the social distancing, financial viability, but equally, a lot of operators were talking about the increased duties for staff around hygiene and supervision and measures just to make sure that people are kept safe. That's the bottom line. A couple of venues mentioned the fact that they were quite heavily reliant on big events and big numbers, and that actually they're going to have to look at a new business model that wasn't so reliant on the bigger events and actually more reliant on, or was basing it on sort of club activity week in, week out with smaller numbers, just because of the challenges presented by social distancing. And then we asked operators what sort of help and support they would need in the future. And to be honest, it's quite pleasing that 100% didn't come back and say financial, we need money from you. Actually, a lot said, thanks for the guidance you've produced. It's been really useful in helping us plan or reopen already. So they were saying more communication, regular communication is really welcome. Sharing of good practice, which obviously this is part of today, but myself and Chris and colleagues are taking that on board to say, look, what good practice can we share? How can we push that out there, be it through the website, be it through webinars, video conference calls, etc. So that was a real focus of the responses that we got. There were a few bits around financial support, obviously capital and revenue, and then a couple of queries about track mark accreditation and cage compliance, which has, for those who don't know, that has been pushed back to April 2022, and we continue to help venues work towards those standards. So in terms of actually getting back to sport and your clubs and your venues reopening, the government at easing of lockdown obviously presented an opportunity to look at opening or at least provide a framework for that. And we hopefully, with the step 1 and step 2 guidance, have given some of the tools that people require to begin to plan for that. I'd reiterate the points that Ash and Chris have made around every venue is different. Every group of athletes, every coach is different. And the locally based risk assessments are really essential to this. And as an operator or a club or anyone who's charged with the responsibility for that, you have to feel comfortable that it's as safe as it can be, as Ash has said, before you open. And there are practical things that you can do to make it safe. So rather than me talk about a utopia, I have got a couple of people who either started going through the process at their club or have been through the process. So hopefully Chris can bring in Mick from Stantonbury in Milton Keynes. So Mick Bromlow.
Right, Mick, I'm attempting to bring you in. I've now unlocked your mic and your camera, Mick, so we can see you and we can hear you. So excellent, technology's working.
Good evening, everyone. We have been responsible for managing our own track since 1992. The track itself is owned by a school, but we are responsible for looking after it out of school hours. We have opened our track, and I'll go you through the details of how we did that. The UKA guidance came out on the 15th of May about 1-to-1 or 2 athletes training together on the track. We had a committee meeting on the 18th, 3 days later, and we went through the document for facility operators very carefully. We looked at each of the individual items and decided which of those risks we could mitigate and which of those we couldn't. And where we couldn't, we decided not to implement those. I'll give you some examples. I think basically our main problem is that we don't have any paid staff. Everything is done by volunteered. In many ways, that's an advantage now because we actually don't have any staff furloughed and so on. But we have to operate in a way that is comfortable for the situation that we're in. So give you some examples of the things that we decided not to do. So we're not allowed to open our clubhouse. We decided that the risk of opening toilets was too great, so there's no toilets. We started opening with just seniors over 18s because we wanted to test the situation before we allowed younger athletes to be there. We decided that the risk of using hurdles was too great because they would have to be cleaned in between one athlete using a set of hurdles and another athlete using a set of hurdles. First aid, we discussed first aid very carefully and decided that having first aid available would be very difficult because as soon as somebody starts using the first aid kit, it becomes compromised. So we decided that every athlete who used the facility would have to be responsible for their own first aid. So there was various things like that that we went through. And I should mention that on my committee, I've got a GP who is able to give us medical advice. And I've got an Army medical reservist who was again able to give us some medical advice. Now, the way we implemented the opening was to divide the track into 3 areas. The infield area, which was for throwers, lanes 1-4, which was for endurance, and lanes 5-8, which was for sprints. And we had one coach offer to look after those 3 individual areas, to take bookings and to look after them. I went away from that committee meeting, produced a risk assessment document. I checked it with our welfare officers. I checked it with our GP and a couple of other people to make sure that we were on the right lines. And from that risk assessment document, I produced a set of notes for publishing on our website on how the facility could be used. And we also had a waiver form made so that athletes could see what they had to do to conform. And those waiver forms were sent to the lead coaches before anyone could actually use the facility. So we opened the track on the 25th of May, that's the following Monday, with just 2 athletes in each of those 3 areas at any one time. We started with slots from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. hourly slots, but it soon became apparent that the throwers needed more, and they wanted 2-hour slots, and the sprinters and the middle distance runners preferred hour and a half slots. So we modified that a little bit as we went on. I went in a couple of days before. We put up lots of notices about what could be done and what couldn't be done. So we opened, it seemed reasonably okay. Not many people used it in the first week. I think there's quite a lot of risk-averse athletes out there, and they weren't rushing to get back to use the system. The following Monday, after a week of operation, there were new guidelines with the 1-to-5 ratios, which came out on the Monday afternoon, and we had a meeting that evening. We modified our opening. Before we could change to the new system, there was 1 or 2 things we needed to check with UKA. So I went back to Ed, specifically the rule on how many groups of 6 you could have in the stadium at any one time is rather vague, and we had wanted to have 3 groups of 6: a throwers group, an endurance group, and a sprinters group. And after a couple of days, Ed came back and said, well, we weren't breaking any rules. So we went ahead with that, and that's been in operation since last Saturday. We also decided that we would reduce the age profile, so athletes 15 to 17 were also allowed to join in, but we still haven't considered the younger age group, I think, which presents a different set of challenges because that's more parent involvement. They don't need as much space. They don't have any personal equipment. There tends to be more groups of them. And we are starting a conversation for another review meeting next Monday.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Mick. And I think it plays out, the approach that you took plays out what Ash was saying earlier on about having more than one person involved in the production of the plan and the risk assessment. Obviously, you've got really competent people on your committee, the medical experts, but equally the number of people you've involved and how you communicated that out, how you started slowly and built up, not afraid to review it on a regular basis. So you were saying about increasing time slots, just a really robust procedure for working through it. I think the example you gave of the 3 groups of 6, that wouldn't work at some venues, but it does at yours. And I think sort of my response to you was, well, yeah, it seems like a robust plan, and if you're in line with government guidance and the EA guidance, that should be fine. I'll mention the ROSPA helpline later, but there's experts there who can help you critique your risk assessments. But I absolutely think that Mick has been through a really robust procedure at Milton Keynes, which seems to have worked for you, Mick, and congratulations on doing that. It's a really good sort of process for working through. Just before we move on to Mike Harris from Trafford, just a question as to what anyone looking at reopening or considering that, any advice you would give to them?
Well, I think the advice is to proceed slowly and with caution. Make sure that you're comfortable with what you're doing. You can increase things as you go along, but make sure we had no idea when we started what the demand would be. So we've actually increased, age groups and so on, while we feel comfortable in doing so. We recognize that we're going to have a particular problem with the younger age groups, and so we've left those for maybe next week or the week after.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate your time, Mick. All the best. I'm sure we'll speak soon in the near future. Thanks, mate.
Right, I'm going to attempt to bring you in, Mike.
If we can bring Mike in, yeah.
Bear with me. Okay, Mike, I've unlocked you, so we should be able to hear and see you any second.
How's that?
Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay, Mike?
Go.
How you doing? So yeah, we've got Mike Harris from Trafford AC, Longford Park. So I mean, it's similar to Mick, Mike. If you just tell us, I know you haven't opened yet, but you've done an awful lot of work and put a lot of things in place in preparation for opening. You just talk us through the sorts of things you've been planning, who you've been working with, and what your plan is for your first few days.
Yes, I think when the guidance first came out and it identified things like you need to identify a COVID-19 coordinator, and I took on that role because I've got the sort of expertise within our area and also the time as well. So as a consequence of that, there's been lots of discussions internally within the club. And we're fortunate in the club basically oversees everything. We manage the facility. The council is very much hands-off. We do keep them informed, but they're very much hands-off. So we've got free rein in that sense. So the vast majority of my communication has been consulting with my committee and my coaches, and we've had several meetings over the last 2 or 3 weeks, which I think and with England Athletics on a regular basis, which I think has given us a real good background to be able to build up to opening on the track next week. And risk assessment has been a big part of that. I've done the risk assessment because I've had experience of that in the past, but we've also got a member within the club who does that as part of his job. So I'm running that past him prior to us opening on Monday for him to perhaps comment on that. But other than that, it's the build up to opening on Monday night, and there are 2 strands to it. There's the stadium, the building side protocol as a venue operator. It's a fairly, if you're not familiar with Longford Park, it's a fairly simple layout in terms of it's athletics only. It's not a sports centre, so it's just a main clubhouse which will be used as a through route. We're closing the changing rooms and locking the toilets, and then we've got a protocol for out on the track, which all the coaches have contributed to. And we've sort of got a detailed booking system for that.
Fantastic. So again, similar to Mick, really robust procedures involving a lot of the key people, coaches, the council, aware of the plans. Obviously, you've had the risk assessments checked by other people. So in terms of how you've communicated that out to athletes and the wider public, what have they received in advance of opening next week?
Well, we've done through our membership database, we've done regular updates throughout the whole CV crisis in terms of where we're at. We've just today put on because next week we're opening and it'll be only to a limited number of members, we've put a short brief statement on our website to that effect. But in terms of direct communication with the athletes, initially, it's going to be the coaches consulting with them, and they are then going to come back to me, submit the names of those athletes who are going to be training with them, which time slots on which nights, and then I will contact those athletes individually and give them both the link to the England Athletics guidelines, but also the specific guidelines for our track. And they will also receive a hard copy as they enter the stadium next week.
Okay, sounds good. I'm sort of practically, are you going from a 2-day a week, 2 evening a week operation to more days, or is it just you're opening more hours to accommodate more athletes? How does it work in practice for the clubs and the athletes that use it?
Yeah, we have expanded our club nights. Traditionally, they're Tuesday, Monday, Thursday, Saturday mornings, and then we have other club users on other nights, as well as some of our athletes. So things like the Tri Club and Chaunt Runners, they're not involved at the moment. So Monday to Thursday night is Trafford AC and Saturday morning. We've got coaches across all 4 nights and 2 sessions each evening, which has given us that flexibility to accommodate each coach and the athletes that they want to train. It does mean that, it may sound a lot, it does mean that we're on the track, we're possibly going to have 4 or 5 groups of 5 athletes, as well as some field event groups. But I think the way we've done it in terms of zoning, warm up, starting points, I think it's quite feasible. I think I said it this morning, bearing in mind that an athletics track is probably 2 or 3 times larger than a Tesco megastore, and I think there's something like 150 people allowed inside those. I think there is, if it's controlled, and we will be assessing it within the first hour and on the first night, and if there's cooperation, then I think it can work. But the proof will be in the pudding.
No, I think that is a really good point. And Ash mentioned about venue capacities earlier on, and I think Northern Ireland used 30. It's difficult. You cannot say, we as a governing body could not say 30 is the number you can have at a venue, because every venue is different and all the groups are different. So as Mike has said, if you've got competent coaches who are well briefed and have been involved in the process managing groups in particular zones, and you're happy that the social distancing and hygiene measures can be maintained and your risk assessments reflect that, then that will be absolutely fine. What we couldn't do as a governing body is say, well, yeah, every venue can open with 30 people, because clearly local measures need to be in place. So yeah, I support the approach you've had, Mike, and involving your coaches and the robust way you've gone about it. Again, sort of with you listening this morning and your thoughts through the process and planning for reopening, is there any bits of advice that you would offer to other clubs or other venue operators who may be on tonight in terms of looking at their plans?
Yeah, it's difficult, like, as you say, because every venue is different. But I would certainly go through the England guidance with a fine tooth comb in terms of trying to do what they're suggesting in terms of coordinator, consulting various organisations, and just being as thorough as you can and communicating. But at the same time, being realistic. The risk assessment is important, because I think if you do go through that, then it does make you realise that it doesn't have to be draconian as such. There is some flexibility in there.
That's good to hear you say that, Mike. So, okay, well, good luck next week when you open. It'd be good to hear from you. I'm sure we'll hear from you in due course, but I hope the open goes well.
Cheers,
I'm sure it will. Thank you. Chris, we were hoping to get Kev on from Keepmo, but I think he's still struggling with his speakers. So I'll just flick on to the ROSPA helpline, talk a little bit about that before Chris wraps up. So Ash has mentioned it before, and I mentioned it that I've offered this as a central point for other venues who have queries. This is a UKA initiative, which is a hotline. So ROSPA, you've got an organisation with a high reputation for safety and expertise. They've set up a hotline, which you can see on there. I believe it's 9 till 5 operation on the phone number, and obviously email at any time. And they're there to help clubs and venues with any queries you may have, or to talk you through the risk assessment process. So yeah, we would urge you to use that if you're unsure, or you have any queries, or you need help in producing your risk assessments. That's a really good resource that you can use. It's free of charge. So yeah, take a note of that number and that email. Chris is sending them out with the slides, but yeah, a useful resource. So yeah, I'd like to thank Mick and Mike for their contributions, which just shows, I think, hopefully shows you that a pragmatic approach in involving people, competent people within committees and other organisations can help you come up with robust risk assessments, which hopefully, if they provide comfort, allow you to reopen. Over to you, Chris.
Brill, thanks, Ed. We've got a few minutes, and we've had a few questions / comments, which I'll try and deal with those, and that will probably take us up to time, but we'll see how we go. So we had a question early on Ash, I'm just going to ask you on this, but I think I know the answer. It was just a question between what is our view on leaving items essentially to sit in the sun and not be used between different people using them versus actually disinfecting and cleaning them. Examples being beds, tapes, that sort of thing. I guess the guidance says clean them in between use, so that's what we would be recommending. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think there's the generally accepted protocol at the moment is that if things are unused for 72 hours, then the virus will reduce in its effectiveness over that period. I guess the caution that I would put on it is if we were to talk about things like tape measures. That tape measure obviously needs to be extended for that period of time to be in contact with ultraviolet light, which is the thing that obviously makes it safe. And without being too high vis in a clipboard, if you leave a tape measure out all over the place, the chances of tripping over it and hurting somebody over that way are also there. So without being facetious, got to be careful about what we do with one thing to manage something else. But yeah, the guidance at the moment, because again, I'll reiterate, there is so little evidence that we can base decisions on at the moment, is that we follow the government guidance in terms of cleaning items between use, and that needs to be a disinfectant that is shown to neutralize the coronavirus. So yes, it may be that as evidence comes on, we can start to accept things like leaving things fallow for a period of time. But at the moment, following the cleaning advice that the government lays out is the way to go.
Thanks, Ash. There was another question about the coaching ratios and coaching assistants working with a group of 5, a coach working with another group of 5, with the coach having overall, I guess, responsibility. That's absolutely fine, as long as there is a qualified person supervising the group of 5 with the correct qualifications. Then it can be a coaching assistant with one group and a coach with another. So that's absolutely fine to do that. I think there was some interesting conversations happening with regards to working with youngsters and the challenges there with parents hanging around, supervising, being available for sort of first aid, that sort of thing. Obviously, the different scenarios are going to be relevant based on whatever your specific setup looks like at your facility. But I think the sorts of conversations you were having over the chat box in here are the sorts of conversations you need to have as a club to come up with the right solution for your site to allow the different groups, different age groups to come back, as per what Mick was saying about, I guess, the process they went through as a committee to make some of those decisions. I'm conscious we do need to wrap up in a minute or so, and I am going to put a quick survey up. There's a few people asking on here for asking for advice for groups of road runners meeting in a park. My obvious quick response is no more than groups of 6, social distancing, do your risk assessments. But I appreciate you may be thinking about more specific guidance or more specific information that you want. Obviously, with 2 weeks to go, we're not going to get to that point now. But can I just ask, for the people that have just said you want some more guidance, can I just ask that you send me an email to club support, which I'm just typing down, at englandathletics.org, just with any very specific questions that you've got regarding the extra advice that you would want from a running perspective. Because I am conscious a lot of what we've focused around has been facilities, has been clubs utilising a track and field venue. So I would be really interested to know what that is. Martin, I did pick up your point about having a conversation with Ed, so I will try and make that happen for you. I've got your email address, so I will go back and do that. Other than that, there were a couple of questions which I'll go back to the individuals over. and we will share we'll share all of the slides from tonight. Obviously, the recording will go live. If you've got any more questions, as I said, if you want to connect with us through a one-to-one meeting, drop us a note to Club Support, and we will do our best to set that up as soon as we can. It might not be with Ed or Ash or myself. It might be with one of our other Club Support team, but we will do what we can to connect you up with someone as soon as possible. So other than that, I hope you all found it useful. Please spare another minute or so to fill out the survey. If you've got any more questions, you can put it into the survey response as well, and we will go through that and pick anything up. So thanks, everyone.